In this video, we'll talk about what is MAC address spoofing attack and generally how it happens and how port security feature is going to be used, how it's going to provide this kind of attacks. That's something what we are going to see here. The first thing, MAC address spoofing attack is like, normally when the user sends a request, the attacker is going to provide with a wrong or false MAC address information, which is going to introduce some man in middle attacks. So let's take an example. In my scenario, I got a user A, which is using the MAC address of A, and there's user B, and these two particular users are trying to communicate with each other. Now, in general, whenever a switch generates a request, the switch is going to update the information in the MAC table, and this user A is connecting on port number 1, and user B is connecting on port number 2. So we got an entry on port number 1, port number 2 with a MAC address of A and B. Now there is an attacker sitting here in the LAN, and maybe he's connecting on port number 10, and the attacker is trying to provide some wrong information. Like in this scenario, the default communication goes from A to B, where the source MAC address will be A and the destination MAC address will be B. Now what attacker is going to do is, attacker is going to pretend to be a B. Now he's going to say that the normal MAC address is X. This is the MAC address of the attacker. The attacker is going to send a request saying that he is the user who is supposed to communicate. Now the switch is going to update the entry on the MAC table. Maybe it will remove from port number 2 and it's going to add on port number 10. So the normal communication, which is supposed to go directly from port number 1 to port number 2, it will go to the attacker, and the attacker is going to send back to the B saying that he is A and he's B. Now attacker is going to change his MAC address and pretend to be A and B, and is going to communicate with A. Now A is going to send the information to X, assuming that this is B, and then the attacker is going to change the MAC address to A again and is going to send back the information to B again. So here the actual traffic which is supposed to flow directly between these two users A and B, it's not going directly, it's going to the attacker, and then attacker is sending back to B here. Now we call this as man in middle attack, where the attacker is going to introduce some kind of man in middle kind of attacks, where the attacker can see all the information, he can extract all the communication between these two devices. Now we call this as MAC spoofing attack or MAC address spoofing attack, where an attacker is going to provide some wrong MAC address information and is going to pretend to be someone in the network. Now something he can do by maybe using some packet capturing tools. He can find the valid MAC addresses and is going to pretend to be someone. Now how we can overcome this kind of attack? Now to overcome this kind of attack, we can use a feature called port security again, the same feature what we discussed previously. Now in that port security, what I can do is I can manually bind the MAC address on a specific ports. We can specifically bind the MAC address on a port numbers. So let's take an example. These are the valid entries for port number 1, port number 2, and port number 3. If the traffic is received from the MAC address, which is binding the port number, it's going to accept the traffic. If the traffic is received with the MAC address, which is binded to the same port, it's going to accept the traffic. And you can see the MAC address, whatever is binded here, it's going to accept the traffic. But if a particular port number 4, in my scenario, the actual binding of the MAC address is BBBB and then this MAC address. This is what we did the binding. And if it receives any other MAC address which is not a part of the binding, which is not binded, it's going to simply drop that particular traffic. Now this is something what we call as port security, where we can add some additional feature called binding the MAC addresses. We can specifically bind the MAC address on a specific port numbers. If that particular port receives with that particular binded MAC address, then only it is going to accept the traffic. Now in this way we can prevent this ARP spoofing attacks, where if it receives any unauthorized MAC address which is not part of a binding, it is going to simply drop that particular traffic. Now to make this possible, we can use some port security feature. Again, I can define the same configurations what we discussed. We can define a maximum of 2 MAC addresses, let's say. And either we can do the manual binding, where I can define what is the port, let's say port number 1, and I can define what MAC address should be learned on port number 1. So I can say on port number 1, I should learn only the MAC address with AA and AB. So which means I'm defining the maximum value of 2. So 2 different MAC addresses are allowed on port number 1. And if it learns any other MAC address other than these 2 MAC addresses, the third MAC, let's say I'm listening with XY, in that case it's not going to accept the traffic from this particular port. And as per the default violation rule, if I say shutdown, it is going to simply put the port into error disabled state. Or we can also use a dynamic binding, something called sticky option, where we can manually define like sticky. Now sticky is an option which will do automatic binding. So let's say I'm defining the maximum MAC address of 2, and by default on port number 1 there is no MAC entries because those are dynamic, it will be removed automatically. So if it learns any MAC address of AB for the first time, it's going to manual bind this MAC. And if it learns any other MAC address AC, it's going to bind on port number 1. So which means it is going, every time any new MAC address is learned on that particular port, it will be automatically binded to that particular port number 1. And if it learns any other MAC address, let's say in my scenario, it's going to learn the third MAC address. As the default violation maximum value is 2, it's going to allow only 2 MAC addresses binded, and this is something binded dynamically. We don't need to specifically manually say MAC address and then type the MAC address. If you're doing it manually, we need to say MAC address and then we need to say AB and then AC in 2 different lines. So instead of doing it manually, we can also do the binding automatically by using a sticky option. Now, port security is going to prevent the MAC address spoofing attack, where an attacker can spoof with an invalid or any other MAC addresses. And what we can do is we can overcome that MAC address spoofing attack by using a feature called port security, where we can manually bind the MAC addresses on that particular ports.